The Skeleton Tree, Chapter 3, The Lifeboat. I am aware that Frank has been talking to me. He brings this to my attention by kicking me in the butt. He doesn't have to get up from his bed to do it. He just swings his leg and boots me. "Hey," he shouts. "Are you all right?" Embers crackle in the fire. Flames leap through the smoke, casting their strange pictures. I nod to tell Frank I'm all right. I was just thinking. "Well, go outside," he says. "You're creeping me out." I take a plastic bucket and fill it quickly with the things I need. A plastic cape and my tattered poncho, the paperback book with its ragged pages, a bottle of water, and half of our last piece of fish. When I open the door, the trees tower above me. Reaching down with shaggy branches from the sea comes the soft bursting of waves, as though the forest is breathing. The trail is a dark tunnel through the salal bushes. Anything could be hiding in there, and 6 weeks ago I would not have dared to go alone. Even now, with the bear and the wolves in my mind, I wished I had waited for Frank. But I know every twist and bend. I have learned my way through all the things that scare me. I just duck my head and run. Branches snatch at my bucket. Roots try hard to trip me, but I keep going. And as soon as I reach the clearing, I see the skeleton tree. It stands alone on the grass-covered rocks, its branches twisting across the sky. The black shapes of coffins rest in its gnarled arms, and I don't look up as I dash underneath them, straight to the rocky shore where the wooden saint looks blindly out to sea. I feel terrible disappointment to find the ocean black and empty. There's no Coast Guard ship, no helicopter. There's nothing but my memories. It was somewhere out there, on the waves that heave and roll, that I last saw Uncle Jack. I screamed his name as the sea came gushing into the cabin, but no one came running down to save me. In the open hatch floated puffy clouds bright with sunshine. The steering wheel gleamed, and the big sail thrashed back and forth as ropes stretched and shuddered. I felt a sudden dread that Uncle Jack had taken the kid and gone away, that I was abandoned on a sinking boat. I squirmed in my sleeping bag. I rolled myself off the bed and sank into ice-cold water that made me gasp. Puff wallowed, and I fell, first against the counter and then against the stove before I fled up the ladder to the cockpit. There was no land in sight. I turned around and looked towards the bow, and there was Uncle Jack and Frank as well, trying to free the little red dinghy that really had become our lifeboat. Puff's bow plunged into the sea, then soared up again with water streaming in silvery sheets. Frank was on his knees, clinging to the rigging as spray flew over him. Uncle Jack slashed at the ropes with a knife, and the waves were enormous. Sunlight flashed on the blade. Then the little boat suddenly sprang from its place. Snatched by a wave, it was pulled right over the lifelines, dragged away by the sea until it snubbed up at the end of its tether. "Get in!" shouted Uncle Jack. But Frank didn't move. Uncle Jack had to pry the kid's fingers from the rigging. He picked him up, bounced on the pitching deck, his feet far apart. He looked big and heroic with the sea raging behind him. When the dinghy shot up on a wave, he dropped the kid inside it. Then he turned around and made his way towards me, reaching for handholds as the sea swept over the deck. He clambered into the cockpit. "Did you bring the radio?" he asked. "No," I said. "The dinghy soared high above us on a passing wave, then dropped below the railing." The kid lay inside it, unmoving. "The flares," said Uncle Jack. "The life jackets." I shook my head. I could hardly think. "Wait here." He plunged down the ladder into the cabin. The water was chest high and rising fast. Everything that could float was swirling around and around. "Uncle Jack, come back!" I shouted. He looked right at me for a moment. "Get in the lifeboat, Chrissy," he said. Then he moved farther into the cabin, pushing his way through a floating mass of cushions, floorboards, and blankets. The deck that had once seemed so high was now level with the sea. Only the low roof of the cabin stood above the water, and every wave surged through the cockpit. "Uncle Jack!" I cried. It looked as though a river was flowing through the hatch and into the cabin. I saw Uncle Jack take the VHF radio from its place, but the water pushed against him, and he couldn't get back to the cockpit. "Here!" he shouted. "Catch!" He tossed the radio up towards me. I tried to grab it. For a moment I had it in my hands, but it fell away. I lunged to grab it again and nearly tumbled through the hatch myself. I grabbed onto its edges as the radio vanished into the swirls of black water. And I saw Uncle Jack looking up at me. I saw fear and sorrow in his expression, and something else as well. I had let him down. The sea gushed through the hatch. It rose right over Jack, sucking him into the darkness. Then enormous bubbles burst through the hatch, and the deck slipped away from my feet, and I was floating in the sea. The top of the cabin vanished. The lifelines dipped into the water. When the little red dinghy swirled over them, I tumbled inside. The kid was sitting upright now, but he didn't say a word. He stared straight ahead. His hands clutched like talons to the side of the boat. The sea was full of ropes and sails, of things that had burst loose from the cabin. I saw boxes of crackers, a loaf of bread, some of Uncle Jack's souvenirs. Then, afraid Puff would drag us down, I struggled with the rope that held us. There was a knot too tight to untie, and I went at it with my hands. Then with my teeth, the lifeboat tipped on one end. The bow went under. I could see Puff down below, a shadowy thing, far under the surface. Then at last, with a snap, the rope tore away, and the lifeboat slapped flat on the water. We began to drift with the wind, lurching over the waves. By then Puff was gone. There was nothing but that terrible sea all around us. In a little red boat, we skidded and whirled down the waves. I screamed until my throat was sore. "Uncle Jack! Uncle Jack!" But there was no echo on the sea, and of course nobody answered. The blue pills had worn off, but everything still seemed dreamily unreal as we floated on that little red boat. As it reeled over the waves, Frank sat without moving. He didn't even shift his weight to keep us level. His jacket zipped up to his chin, his hands clamped to the side of the boat. He looked right at me without seeing me. At the other end I leaned forward or sideways or backwards to keep us level, but water still slopped over the sides and soon filled the boat to our ankles. The plastic scoop had tangled around the oars. I snapped it from its string and started bailing. I looked at my watch many times before I realized it had stopped. Seeing the hands frozen in place made me feel angry and hopeless. I leaned back my head and shouted at the sea and sky. At sunset the wind fell, the waves began to flatten, and there was no danger of sinking. But I felt more frightened than ever as I watched the sky turn red. In that tiny boat far from land, I began to wonder what Uncle Jack had really seen. What if all the people who had been swept to sea were floating along around us? In every way I was adrift in the dark. I didn't know where I was going or what I would find. I just wished I was home with my mother. I pictured her standing at the big front window looking out at the same darkness, thinking of me as I was thinking of her. But she would have no idea that I was lost on the ocean. She would imagine me sailing happily with Uncle Jack. Darkness settled. Then stars chalked the sky, more stars than I'd ever seen. Across them drifted satellites flying along with a silent, steady purpose that made me feel horribly lonesome. Frank sat as rigid as ever, rising up against the stars when the boat lifted on the waves. Shivering with cold, I tightened my sodden jacket and rubbed my arms to keep warm. At dawn I saw clouds in the distance. Then under the clouds I saw land, a line of jagged mountains with snow-covered tops. Currents and winds were pushing us in that direction, but so slowly that I thought we might never reach shore. Frank's fingers were white and wrinkled, like drowned worms, hooked over the edge of the boat. His teeth ticked as they chattered, and little tremors ran through him, twitching around his eyes. I was terribly afraid he would die. I worried about what would happen if he did. I couldn't sit with a dead boy. But how could I roll him out of the boat and watch him sink into the water's blue darkness? I pried out the oars and began to row. For hours and hours I rowed that boat. My hands grew blisters and the salt water that trickled down the oars made them burn. The sides of the boat warped in and out until little bubbles started streaming up through the corners. Water oozed through the bottom. Rowing the boat would destroy it, but I had no choice. At the end of the day, the mountains looked huge. The land appeared wild and empty, and when the sun went down, there was not a single light along that huge shore. Not a sign of people anywhere. Then the wind began to rise again, and the waves grew taller, and sometime before dawn, I heard the rumbling sound of surf. I raised my head to look around the pale moonlight. Ghostly plumes of spray appeared. The surf grew louder, and I saw streaks of foam shredded from the crests of the enormous waves. The boat rushed like a sled through the darkness. I tore off my jacket, hoping I could row a little harder without it, and tried to drive the little boat away from land, but we were swept in among the breakers, and one hammered down on us. The oars flew away as I tumbled into the sea. Gasping from the cold, I struggled to the surface. My flailing hands clutched onto the boat. Now upside down, it was a little arched out of the sea like a turtle. I gripped it, its little spine, and held myself there. 10 feet away, in the gray foam of the breakers, Frank floated face down. His black hair shone flat and smooth. His jacket puffed out around his back, swollen with air, and holding his arms splayed across the water. I could hold on to the boat and ride it to shore, or I could let go of my last hope and try to save Frank. But I barely thought about it. I pushed away from the boat and grabbed Frank. I held onto his jacket, onto his collar, onto his arms, while tumbling a wave tried to tear us apart. He snapped awake. His head shook like a dog's, flinging water from his hair. His eyes grew impossibly big, and then, with both hands, he clutched onto me, pinning my arms to my side. I couldn't swim. I couldn't even keep us afloat, but the more I struggled to get away, the more Frank fought to hold me. We both sank underwater, and the next wave drove us deeper. It rolled us over and over in frozen darkness. It scraped us across the rocks on the bottom, then spun us up to the surface. I gasped as the surf thundered around us, and I kept my arm around Frank, lifting his head out of the water. We were just tiny things in the surf, pushed here and there, pummeled and punched. The waves whirled us along, but everyone swept us closer to the land, and the 7th or 8th or 9th slammed us down on a stony beach. With a rumble and clatter, it drained away and left us stranded. I heard the boom of the next wave smashing. It pushed us up higher up the beach and then tried to pull us back as it drained away in a gurgling rush through the stones. I grabbed a rock and held on. Wave after wave reached up to get us. They pulled away at my boots, one after the other. They pulled Frank out of my arms and dragged him down the beach, on his back, slithered, spread-eagled, over moonlit stones, screaming at me to save him. I grabbed his leg and crawled up to the beach like a crab, scuttling a few feet at a time. My hands were bleeding, my knee throbbed, but I kept moving up from the sea, and Frank crawled along behind me like some terrible creature slithering from the depths. At the top of the beach we found a cliff, and we sat with our back against it. I couldn't believe how I tumbled so quickly from an ordinary life into my very worst nightmare. I was stranded in the wilderness with a kid who seemed barely alive, and I had no idea who he was. At dawn I looked out on a dreadful world. Waves thundered into the cove and hurled themselves at the stones below us. A line of kelp and seaweed lay bundled like a rope along the base of the cliff. But there was not a stick of driftwood, and that puzzled me for a moment. Then I realized what it meant. At high tide the beach would disappear. The cove would fill like a huge bucket, and we would drown like mice inside of it. I shoved Frank's shoulder. "Get up," I told him. He groaned. He pushed my hand away, but he lifted his head and looked around us, then dragged himself to the cliff. He pressed a hand against a rock where a trickle of water made it black and shiny. In a very little while, his palm began to fill. He slurped up the water and filled it again, and beside him I did the same thing. Together we drank water from the stone. When he'd had enough, Frank turned to the seaweed and pulled out handfuls of leaves. They looked like lettuce gone bad in a crisper, but Frank shook off the pebbles and twigs, the tiny shells, and stuffed the seaweed into his mouth. The sound of his chewing made my stomach gurgle. I had eaten nothing since my night at the dock in a puff. He looked at me as though I was stupid. It's all safe, moron. Says who? He didn't answer. He kept chewing, stuffing more seaweed into his mouth. How do you know it's safe? I asked him again. But he still didn't tell me. I was so hungry that I didn't care if the seaweed made me sick. I plucked out wrinkled leaf and started eating, and once I started, I couldn't stop. Some of the seaweed was crunchy, some was soft and slimy, and it slithered down my throat like globs of snot. All of it tasted awful, but I gorged myself anyway. Frank gazed out at the sea and across the little cove. Then he turned to me and asked, still chewing, "Where's Jack?" The question sort of stunned me. I was afraid to tell him the truth, in case he fell into his eerie sleep again, or in case he refused to move until I answered 100 questions. So I told a shameful lie. "He's gone ahead to look for help." "Then let's find him." Frank stood up. He looked around again, down at my feet. "Hey, where are your shoes?" "I lost them," I said. Moron. The cliffs were less than 20 feet high, but the rocks were sharp and jagged. With cuts on my hands and nothing but socks on my feet, I climbed a lot slower than Frank. But he didn't try to help me. He just scrambled up and disappeared over the edge. By the time I reached the top, I was sure he would be miles ahead, but he was lying on his back on a bit of grass with dried stems stuck in his teeth. I had never imagined we would find people just beyond the cove, but it was still a huge disappointment to look over to the north and see empty wilderness stretch on forever. If we had come to an island, it was enormous. Too big to walk around, too mountainous to cross. If we landed on the mainland, we might have to trek 1,000 miles to find another person. It seemed useless to go on, but just as useless to stay where we were. "How far did we go before we sank?" I asked. Frank didn't answer. "How long were we sailing?" He still ignored me. He spat out the grass stem and flicked his hair. "Jack's dead, isn't he?" he asked. I couldn't admit it so bluntly. I just nodded. "Why didn't you tell me the truth?" "I don't know," I said. "I was trying to help." Frank glared at me. "The day I need your help, that's the day I kill myself." Well, I had already saved his life, but I didn't point that out. Frank got up and started walking. A moment later, he whirled around and shouted at me, "Do you know he's dead?" "Yes," I told him. "I saw it." "You saw what?" I felt tears coming into my eyes, so I turned away. "He was in the boat when it sank," I said. "He was right in front of me, down in the cabin." "Then why didn't you save him?" I looked up and stared right back, not caring now if my eyes were red. "Why didn't you save him?" I said. "I would have," said Frank, "if I had been close. He told me to stay outside." My hands were clenched so tightly that my fingernails pressed into the skin. "He went down to get the radio, and then the water trapped him. What do you think I could do, you stupid idiot?" "You could have tried," said Frank. I shrieked at him. "The boat was sinking!" Just a few feet apart, we snarled like animals about to kill each other. My heart was pounding, and Frank was flushed with anger. But just as I thought he was going to hit me, he reached up and flicked his hair again. Then he turned towards the sea, and a little bit of calm came over us. "So what about the radio?" His back was towards me. "Did he get it? Did he call for help?" "No," I said. "Why not?" I didn't want to tell him about my fumbled catch, but in my mind came an image of Uncle Jack in the sinking boat, and it didn't seem fair to tell less than the truth. "He got the VHF," I said. "He tried to toss it through me through the hatch, but I missed." A little sound came from Frank. Because I couldn't see his face, I didn't know if he was angry or amused. When he slowly turned around, I saw only that annoying sort of pout that hid all expression. "You're such a moron," he said. "I would have caught it." "You couldn't even move. You were like a zombie." I glared up at him. "Why were you on the boat anyways? How do you know my Uncle Jack?" Frank just shrugged. "Who are you?" I hated looking up to him. He stared back until I had to turn away. Then he laughed and said, "I'm your guardian angel, Chrissy. I've been sent to Earth to save you." Yeah, whatever. I went on towards the north again, along the narrow strip between the cliff and trees. but Frank barreled past and led the way. His jacket, still soaking wet, dripped water. His boots were squelching with every step. Oh, I envied his boots. My socks already had holes in the heel and my toes poked out the front. Stones and roots jabbed into my feet. We could take turns with those boots, I said. Yeah, I guess we could, said Frank, but he kept on walking. Where the cliffs jutted, we took shortcuts through the forest, down trails the deer had made. Frank liked to bend the branches and let them spring back at me, so I learned to stay a bit behind. He plucked berries from the bushes and shoved them into his mouth. You shouldn't eat those, I told him. Why not? They could be poisonous? He laughed his annoying laugh and kept eating. Didn't you ever hear poisonous berries? I asked. A heavy branch snapped from his hand and swung towards me. Didn't anyone ever show you the good ones? Didn't your dad do that? No, I said. Why not? I don't know. It was a stupid question. He just didn't. Frank grunted. You don't go grazing for berries in the city, I told him. Where do you live? He wouldn't answer that either, but he was desperate to show he knew more than me. The purple ones are salal, he said. The red ones are huckleberries. So are the blue ones, I think. He stopped and broke off a sprig of red berries. He peeled away a handful of them and shoved them in his mouth. Juice dribbled down his chin as he held out the branch. Try some, he said. I'll wait a bit. Moron. He shrugged and started walking. I watched him carefully in case he began to stagger. But the foul taste of seaweed was still in my mouth, and I ached with hunger. So after a while I tried the berries. The salal tasted bitter, but the huckleberries were sweet and juicy. They took away my thirst, but I felt hungry as ever. Our clothes dried as we walked. Frank took off his jacket and carried it over his shoulder, and in the miles that passed we never said another 2 words. I watched with dread as the sun sank lower, and I wished that my father had been more like Frank's. No one had ever taught me how to find water on a cliff or food in a forest. When Frank stopped to drink from a little stream, I kept trudging along, thinking about things. The forest grew dark, and when I looked back, Frank was not there. I called his name, but he didn't answer. I had no idea how far I'd gone without him. I started back at a walk, and then a run, and then I found Frank kneeling by the same stream. In front of him lay a little pile of twigs and moss. He was busy scraping sticks together. What are you doing? I asked. What does it look like, moron? He didn't even lift his head. I'm making a fire. You could have told me you stopped, I said. Why? He asked, still not looking up. Why not? I said. I got you to shore. I saved your life. We have to stay together. Why? He asked again. 'Cause that's what you're supposed to do, I shouted. Why? I felt like picking up one of those stones from the river and bashing his stupid head. I plopped down on the grass and watched him. I had always thought that lighting a fire would be pretty easy, but I had never seen anyone actually try. Though Frank rubbed the sticks together furiously, I saw no spark or plume of smoke. He had a serious, stubborn look that was somehow sad to see. His hands began to shake, his teeth showed in a hard line. He hunched forward over the little shreds of moss and worked in a sudden burst that left him exhausted. At last he fell back, muttering to himself as he glared at the sticks. I tried to encourage him. It would be nice to have a fire, I said. What anger flashed over him. Do you think you can do better? He asked. No, I said. That's not... Anyone who thinks it's easy to start a fire in the rainforest doesn't have a clue. Frank picked up the sticks again. The sky darkened. A swarm of black flies came. Frank swatted them away as he worked, then suddenly swept the moss away and threw the sticks inside. We don't need a fire tonight, he said. It's too hot. While he was hot, he was sweating from his efforts, but I was already cold. Frank pulled his jacket around himself like a little tent and huddled inside of it, safe from the black flies. I kept slapping at them as they whined all around me, and I shivered in my t-shirt and sweater. From the distance came the howling of wolves. More eerie for its faintness, the sound tingled through my nerves. I didn't sleep until the sky began to brighten. Then as soon as I closed my eyes, it seemed Frank was standing beside me, kicking my sore feet. Let's go, he said. His fingers and lips were stained blue with the huckleberry juice. But he didn't bring any berries for me or give me a chance to find my own. He kicked me again and started walking north. I had to scramble to follow him. We stayed on the edge of the sea, sometimes high on the sheer cliff, sometimes down on the little beach of gravel or rock. 3 or 4 times I looked at my watch and saw the hands frozen at 3:15. It was as though we were doomed to walk forever, with time never changing. "Where are we going?" I asked Frank's back as we passed through the strip of trees. "What are we going to do?" As always, he ignored me. We went another half of a mile across a ridge and out again to the cliffs. Frank stopped and turned around. He looked angry. "Why are we going north?" he asked. I shrugged. "What's the diff?" "What's the diff?" he said, mocking me with a laugh. "What are you, 8 years old?" Stiffened with salt, his hair hung over his eyes like a pirate's patch. "How do you know there's not a whole city just south of here?" It was another question that I had no answer to. I said, "I don't think there's a city anywhere." "You don't know that, moron." "I saw the land from the boat," I said. "You didn't." Frank crossed his arms. "Maybe we should split up. You go north and I'll go south." I didn't like that idea, and he knew it. He just wanted me to plead with him. But I had done that too often for schoolyard bullies to want to do it again. If I let him push me around once, it would never stop. He would just push harder the next time. I shrugged and said, "Whatever," and started walking north. Frank didn't follow me. It would have been too embarrassing to turn around and trail along behind him like his puppy, so I kept on going. After a half-mile, I knew I'd made a big mistake. Below me was a little beach covered with garbage. I decided to explore it, hoping to find a pair of shoes for my sore feet. Then I could climb again to the next point, turn around and catch up with Frank. "There's nobody there," I'd tell him. "We have to go south." It was a clever plan. He would get what he wanted, but I wouldn't be giving up. It was what my father would call a win-win. In Vancouver, I couldn't have walked a quarter mile on English Bay without finding a flip-flop, a sandal, or sneaker. Along with baseball caps and disposable lighters, they had seemed as common as clamshells. In Alaska, it was even better. The beach was made of pebbles. I sank right into them, as though trudging through a bowl of marbles. Among the stranded logs, I found the same sort of stuff I had seen floating in the ocean and remembered Uncle Jack. "It's all going to wash up on the shore one day." I found bottles and buckets and bones of a giant whale. I found 2 cigarette lighters that wouldn't work, and then a sandal for my right foot. It was so oversized that it might have belonged to Bozo the Clown, but I slipped it on. And soon I found a pink flip-flop with a little heart on the sole. Proud to have solved at least one of my problems, I tackled the rocks at the end of the beach. I climbed up and up until I came out on top of a cliff so high it made me dizzy. White gulls flew below me, tipping in the wind, and I must have seen for 100 miles, over forests and mountains, with no sign of people. At that moment, I was absolutely certain we would never find anyone to the north. I would have wanted to find Frank and head south, but a bigger, better beach lay before me now, made of sand like golden sugar. It stretched for a mile along the shore, and the breakers tossed and gleamed. Standing high above it, I felt as though I owned all I could see. I had stepped into my mother's favorite movie, Robinson Crusoe. I could picture the castaway in his ragged goatskins, looking over the ocean from a ridge on his lonely island. That movie always made my mother cry. "We're all of us castaways," she told me once. "We get thrown ashore on the rocks of life, but somehow we survive." I looked back down the hill that I had climbed. Something was moving through the bushes, crawling up towards me. Wolves, I thought. Too frightened to move, I just watched the bushes sway and toss. I heard the branches crackle. Then in a break between 2 trees, Frank appeared. He was hurtling up the slope, almost frantically it seemed, as though something was chasing him. He pulled with his hands as he pushed with his feet, blundering through the bushes. Then he glanced up and saw me standing up above him. For a moment I thought he was going to turn back. He sank down into the bushes, then appeared again, and started walking up the hill. When he reached me, he was breathing heavily. I looked for miles to the south, he said. There's nobody there. He wiped sweat from his forehead. We'll go north instead, so you can stop crying now, you little crybaby. Well, I wasn't crying. It was Frank who had lost something, and we both knew it. He shouldered past me to lead the way, and I followed in my familiar place. But I didn't mind anymore. I had learned an interesting lesson. Even Frank didn't want to be left all alone in the wilderness.